I'll preface this by saying I think I'm silly to believe in ghosts, and I get embarrassed to speak about it. You're welcome to offer logical explanations. This took place over a few years in a farmhouse in the desert of Arizona. It was newly developed land, and we moved into the place when I was 15. At the time, I was going through a lot emotionally. The house was set up almost plantation style. It was very wide and narrow, a big wraparound porch, and lots of awkward corners. The front room was a tall library with an open balcony to the stairs, which ran into the long, skinny bedrooms. My parents' room was closest to the stairs and attached to a nursery with a sliding ensuite door. My brother's, 2 years younger, and my room was at the end of a dark hallway. That side of the house never got sun, so it was bad vibes all round. Downstairs, there was a messed up Harry Potter-style closet, a sunken living room, a kitchen in the center of the house, and a sunken playroom for the baby. It honestly started the day we moved in. My brother and I were the only ones in the house, unboxing plates. The place was so empty, everything echoed. I swear it sounded like a little girl laughed, like a creepy track you could get off an app or something. Keep in mind, the TVs were not plugged in. We were on an acre of land far away from the dirt road, and my brother was way too stupid to pull a prank like that. I started hearing voices at night. This wasn't unusual. I honestly used to freak myself out so badly. My parents had raised me not to talk about things scaring me, to tough it out and be a big girl. It was fine most of the time during the day. Everything came at night. I remember distinctly when it started messing with me in bed. In solidarity, my brother and I kept our bedroom doors open for the hallway's nightlight, and in case we needed to call for each other. We had a pretty messed up childhood that might have contributed to all the codependency I'll describe during this. I was falling asleep, but not quite out. I felt the blanket slipping off my bed and reached down to grab it. This was common. I didn't have a bed frame with a foot. It kept slipping no matter how much I tried to tuck it in. In classic horror movie fashion, the last time I pulled it, I felt tension. There was nothing it could have been caught on. I feel like the second I went from confused to terrified, it bounced back at me. I don't know how to explain this, but I was sure someone was lurking under my bed, pulling it from me. Later, I moved another nightlight into the bedroom. It was a kind of spooky amber orange, and I convinced my parents to let me paint the walls cherry red. Again, I was almost asleep, but not quite asleep, so I don't think it could have been sleep paralysis. I heard the carpet rustle and maybe joints cracking. It sounded like my room had come to check on me. I opened my eyes and immediately froze. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life. There was a woman crawling across my floor from the far side of my room to the foot of my bed. She was pale and stringy-haired, like she was going bald. I couldn't see her face. I don't know how I fell asleep. I couldn't scream or move. I think she disappeared under my bed. My baby brother was about 7 months old when she started coming out during the day. My mum was a teacher at the time and was able to stay home with us during summer vacation. It was lunchtime and we were watching a movie quietly downstairs while the baby napped. There were noises upstairs, like something dropped to the ground. We listened for a second before my mum ran up. She thought the baby had fallen out of his crib. We opened the door and found him asleep. There was something weird on the floor. It took us a while to figure out. It was drywall or something. There was a crawl space to small attic where the AC and insulation could be reached. It was barely big enough to get into and a good 9 feet from the ground. It had also been pushed up and slid over to open. There was a visible gap. The carpet was a really ugly dark blue, so we could see the spots on the ground like something was dragged from one side of the room to where the crib was. It stopped right in front of it. My mum checked the closet and called my stepdad. He couldn't leave work, so we stayed downstairs until he got home and checked the crawl space. We have never had animals. It's really difficult for most things to live in Arizona, so wildlife is pretty rare in that area. He didn't find anything or signs of anything living up there. This happened every other day for 2 weeks. We really didn't know what to make of it. My mum thought it may be the AC suctioning the opening up. It stopped and didn't happen again for 2.5 years. When my baby sister was born and stayed in the same crib, again, it happened on and off for a few weeks, and never again. The AC never popped that opening open again. To keep my own solo experiences brief, I had a period of 3 months where I straight up did not sleep. I went crazy. Every night, I felt like my bed was shaking. The instant I laid my head down, it would vibrate. The metal frame would sway. I'd feel like someone was pushing the mattress between the baseboards or sitting on the corner. I had my brother touch the frame one night to tell me if the shaking was in my head or not. He said it wasn't, but I'm not sure if he was just playing into it. I thought I might be having seizures or something. At one point, I got so frustrated, I started sleeping on the couch downstairs with the dog. I started hearing whispers too. Not a noise that sounded odd, but someone calling my name. My name has 3 syllables. I would be in my room, door open, doing something at night after my parents went to bed. It was a female voice, but it sounded off. I don't know how to explain it. The downstairs really scared me after the lights went out, so I never went down, but I did walk to the balcony to look down. I never saw anything, but the whispering would stop when I got close. My brother started hearing it too. He's kind of weird. His life's dream has been to enlist in the army, so his reaction was always getting his knife and walking right downstairs to confront it. He'd turn on the lights and look around before coming back up. He slept on my floor a few nights because he was convinced she wanted me. We had prior haunting experience which led to my parents making jokes that ghosts follow us. They didn't pay much attention to it at this time when it was quiet. One night, my parents went out with the babies. My brother and I were in our rooms, doors open as per usual. We started hearing something weird. I thought it was the wind. It got louder until it was clear. A woman was wailing. I know it sounds crazy, but it was so clear. We hid in my room for what felt like hours, calling my mum. For some reason, it didn't occur to us to call the police. The crying stopped. We hatched a plan to run for the stairs and out the nearest door. All of the lights were on in the house, and my brother had his stupid knives. It's like it knew we were going to leave. We heard shuffling outside the door, and maybe breathing. It couldn't have been the air conditioning. We kind of decided that we were ready to die, unlocked the door, and booked it. The crying started again, and it was clear it was in my parents' room. We stood outside of the property line for an hour, waiting for them to come home, watching the house. No one could have gotten out without us seeing. We had huge windows lining the upstairs hallway that showed everything with the lights on. My parents made fun of us, and still do about that night. A few other incidents include my baby brother talking to the man upstairs. He'd stand in front of the balcony and talk up to someone. He told us the man was hiding in my room. He talked about the man in the window and would ask, "Who's that?" directed at the doors at night. I don't want to talk about all of it, but there were so many instances of voices, doors slamming, and things being knocked over in my room that I thought I was losing my mind. I moved out at 18 and came back occasionally, usually to babysit. Apparently, my reluctant believer mother and absolute skeptic stepdad watched a coffee pot jump off the counter. They were also sitting outside having an open fire evening when they saw a figure in the balcony window of their bedroom. He was a tall man, but my stepdad still needed urging to go upstairs. It appeared a second time, closer to where the nursery door was. My mum said she had horrible dreams about a man in the corner of her room after that. She was present for many of the times we heard footsteps upstairs, doors slamming when the AC was off, etc., but she always denied there being anything wrong. My parents left town with the kids for a week. At this point, I was 19 and living happily an hour away. My mum begged me to check on my brother and stay a few nights for the weekend. I arrived during the evening, after I got off of work. I asked how it had been alone. He said he was fine, he just didn't go upstairs at night and minded his business. He said if he ignored it and tried not to get scared, then it ignored him. He felt safe with the dog. We were watching YouTube and eating when we started to hear a deep noise. At first, I thought it was a bike or one of those small buggies people drove out there. Then I noticed it was holding a tune. It was humming. The dog had a weird thing about staring into the bedroom if the door was open, which was scary at night. This time, the door was closed and he still stood up and stared. The noise was so deep, it sounded like it couldn't be human, but it was definitely melodic. There's nothing I could figure out to explain it. My brother and I just kind of looked at each other. Then a door slammed upstairs, and we decided to get out and go on a walk. When we got back, I decided I would sleep in my parents' room. It didn't feel right to stay in the kids' room, but looking back, it would have been best to stay close to my brother. I fell asleep surprisingly easily. I guess about 2 hours passed by before my brother slammed the door open. The house smelled like it was burning. Not really like a fire smell, but like burning plastic and trash. I was panicked. I was the adult and didn't know what to do. We checked the house. I turned off the air conditioning, thinking it might be on fire. We opened all the windows and fell asleep on the couches downstairs. The next day, the smell was still lingering, but less overwhelming. The air conditioner was fine when I turned it back on. Like usual, the day was fine. That next night, my brother and I went on a Jack-in-the-Box run. It might have taken 30 minutes. We arrived home to a mess of blood, vomit, and crap. The dog was sick all over the living room. We immediately took him to an emergency vet, certain he was dying. They checked him for everything they could and gave him a clean bill. When we got home, all hell broke loose. My brother and I were cleaning up the mess with the doors open for airflow. There was absolutely insane banging noises from upstairs. We hadn't locked up on our way out. My brother thought someone had snuck in and was trashing the upstairs. He went up to check, and I hung downstairs ready to call the police. Nothing happened. Nothing even seemed out of place. We kept cleaning, but the noise started almost immediately. It kind of sounded like someone was shouting behind a wall of cement. I couldn't tell the gender. My brother told me he had been fine until I got there, that I could leave if I wanted. I totally did, and I didn't go back. My parents sold the house this year. During the interim of the move, they stayed in an Airbnb. My brother lived really close to his work, so he stayed in the house with the dog for a few weeks. This story is just his own. so I'm still not sure if I believe it. He's kind of weird, but not one to embellish. He had been hearing the usual things, even his name being called in the night, but ignoring it all. His friends had been coming over to keep him company. The last day he was supposed to finish moving, he brought a friend. He says he felt like they were being watched the whole time they cleared the place out, and his friend left him to lock up. They got into the car, facing the house, when they noticed the blinds were open. They were definitely closed on the way out. His friend claims he saw them open from the side of his eye. My brother says there was a woman squatting in front of the downstairs window, close to where he had just left from. She was pale, her nose was hooked, and her hair was black and stringy. Again, classic horror movie ghost. He said she had black eyes, with visible white dots in the middle, inside-out eyes as he called them, and she was smiling. He says it took him a second of shock to realize she was looking right at him. He felt sick, like she would walk right out and get him. They burned rubber when his friend snapped out of it, and they screamed at each other all the way down the road about what they saw. He called me right after to explain it, but I was with friends and not really willing to listen. What messes me up is that my mum thought he had a psychotic break. He went into his room and cried all night at the Airbnb. She thought something happened with his girlfriend. My brother is not a crier. I haven't seen him do it since we were little. When we got together and talked about it, his eyes teared up then too. He said he didn't know why, but he knew she wanted to kill him. He drew a picture of her. It's not great, but it still fills me with the deepest foreboding. It took me a while to realize that I saw her too, just once in my bedroom almost 5 years ago. Seeing her suddenly made sense. I knew it didn't feel like a woman, but it felt feminine. It felt like something pretending to be a woman. My ex brought this up today. We dated all through high school and had a few experiences together that she recounts as her only paranormal encounters. I would love to still think that this was my own delusion, but it was shared by too many people to be. Maybe a few things are explainable, but most of it isn't. It's affected me so deeply, I'm still terrified that if I think too much about her, she'll follow us a state away. We've since had word from neighbors that the previous family had 12 people, Mormons, living in a house we could only fit 6 into. They were really weird according to multiple families, and they moved in with 5 kids and left with 4. We heard a toddler drowned in the upstairs bathtub. No idea which one, or if this is true. We couldn't find any documentation. I wouldn't go back if I was paid. It was last summer. My girlfriend, now wife, and I finally made the big decision to move in together. Cobblestone Square is a situation of apartment complexes surrounding a central park. After living in another apartment for 2 years, I learned a bigger apartment was opening up on the other side of the complex. We needed bigger space because my wife had 2 children from a previous marriage. After a rushed inspection, we were happy to move in as June started. The months passed by, and the days grew shorter and colder. Autumn was drawing to a close, and with it, that's when the trouble began. In all the stories and movies, it starts out small. Things move from place to place, lights being left on, etc., all chalked up to forgetfulness. This was true in our case, and we didn't think much of it. It only started to escalate with the children. Our apartment is set up with 2 bedrooms and bath on the opposite end of each other. In our bedroom, we have our own private bathroom, and next to the kids' room is a small hallway leading to their own bathroom. We would give them baths here and potty train, and almost as if flicking a switch, when the autumn months came, our youngest, a 2-year-old girl, would absolutely hate going in that bathroom. At the mere mention of bath time, she would go into hysterics. On good days, she would sit in the tub, and in the process of bathing, she would look past myself and my wife and start screaming and crying. Oftentimes, something would catch her eye in the mirror, and she would also start crying like mad. The most unsettling part would be that as soon as we took her out of the bathroom, she would start acting like nothing happened. Our son, who was 4 at the time, also would run up to us and say that he would hear a voice saying, "Uppy," which is a common saying among the children when they wanted to be held. We asked if it was his sister, and he would profusely say it wasn't her, but he did say it sounded like a kid. This happened a few times. With my wife being separated from her first husband and splitting custody, we would have the children come live with us every other week. On other weeks that the children would go stay with their dad, the activity would seem to die down, but that didn't mean it wouldn't happen. I asked my wife what she remembered from last year, and she recounted a time we didn't have the children, and she was cleaning the house. She noticed the kids' door was open. We usually keep it closed, but thought that maybe I went into their room for something, checking to see if I was inside, and seeing I wasn't, she closed the door and didn't think much of it. It wasn't until later that she went to use the kids' bathroom and saw that the door was open again. She found me in our room and asked if I had opened it. I said I didn't. With more incidents of lights being found on and doors opening, it all came to a head near the end of October when I was washing dishes in the kitchen. Above the sink, facing the living room, is a small window that allows someone in the kitchen to look out into the dining room and living room, and additionally, the back door, which is a sliding glass door. Important detail. After the kids had been put to bed and were asleep, my wife and I set about our nightly duties of chores to finish before the next day started. As I was washing the dishes, I looked up from the sink and saw in the glass of the sliding door a reflection of a large shadow in the hallway to the kids' bathroom. It quickly entered the bathroom, and I immediately walked over, turning on the light and seeing nothing there. I went to my bedroom where my wife was vacuuming, and I asked her if she by chance went to the kids' bathroom for whatever reason. I wasn't surprised by her response when she said no, and I told her what I saw. It was after this event and subsequent Halloween that all the activity seemed to stop. Months passed by again and jumped to 2020, August. As soon as the activity started again, I started to keep a journal of all the findings. That way, there was a record. On August 10th, I went out to go to the bathroom in the kids' bathroom before going to bed and heard a small child giggle. Both children were fast asleep. August 11th, my wife was bathing our daughter, and in the first time in a year, our little girl started to shriek in fear until she was taken out of the bathroom. August 13th, while getting ready for bed, our son knocked on our door. I'm always the one to answer, and he told me that he was afraid. He wouldn't elaborate on what, but when I laid him down in his bed, he begged for the closet to be closed. The closet has never been a problem, and a few nights after this, we returned it to being open, and haven't experienced something like this again. August 15. My wife and I had an argument and I went out to the couch to sleep for the night. As I was tossing and turning, I heard a child's voice in the night say, "Uh-huh," as if answering a question. I forced myself to go to sleep. Both myself and my wife have caught our son speaking to himself as well. My wife told me that once she heard him saying, "Ow, stop it, you're hurting me," and when she went to go check on him, he was in the hallway by the kids' bathroom, holding his arm. During the daytime, the kids were playing, and both my wife and I were doing our own thing. As I was sitting on the couch, Our son runs behind the couch, stops, and says, "And how would you do that?" Out of the blue. I turn to him and ask who he's talking to, and after a moment of hesitation, he says nobody. I told him I heard him say something, and he then insisted he didn't say anything. One occasion, my wife was sleeping on the couch and in the middle of the night heard a man's whisper say, "Don't get up," to which she promptly obeyed. It was the night after I woke up from my sleep in bed to see a shadow shape standing over me with piercing red eyes. I felt it was going to hurt me. My wife and I have naturally begun our interest into the spiritual world. We began researching and looking into ways to go about this. We've purchased a Ouija board with no results from a medium and supposedly a haunted ring. If our apartment was going to be haunted, we wanted to know by who and with what intentions. It seems as if our mail order ghost has already made their home, as one morning our front door was unlocked and slightly ajar. Nothing stolen. Tonight, as I write this, my wife and I were watching TV on the couch and decided to call it a night. But as we went to our bedroom, I noticed a low scratching sound coming from the record player. I opened it up and saw that the turntable was moving as the needle was off its holder. I replaced the needle and tried knocking the player a few times to see if it could have easily been bumped and knocked off. But no, the only way to move that needle was to pick it up with your fingers and set it down. I was reminded of the one time this happened, long before we bought any haunted items. I'm thoroughly convinced my apartment is haunted. People die in them way too often to think it's not a possibility. And if nobody died here, the cemetery across the road definitely doesn't bring me any comfort. As I write this, I can say that two distinct entities can be somewhat accounted for. A small child ghost and something else, or maybe something that wants to be viewed as a child. But let's think happy thoughts. We still live here to this day. Autumn is just beginning, and that's when things seem to really get interesting around here. When I was a sophomore in college, I lived in an apartment in NYC on Roosevelt Island, which is nestled between Manhattan and Queens. The island has a dark history, and at one point, there were insane asylums and a smallpox hospital. It's actually pretty fascinating if you want to Wikipedia it. But with all that suffering, the island seems to still carry on that burden. So our apartment was laid out in a sort of L shape. The living and dining room faced part of the hallway. There was a bathroom at the end of the hall that was small and led to the two bedrooms, one of which had a balcony off of it. I'm not gonna lie, we had a killer view, and for a dorm, we felt like we were living pretty large. But not long after we moved in, my three roommates and I began to all experience some things. It started with the feeling like we were being watched all of the time. I remember specifically I was home alone and working on a mural. I'm an art student, and I began to feel very uneasy, like someone was right behind me the whole time watching me. This went on for about an hour, and I just couldn't shake this feeling, but did my best to just roll with it. But I'll admit it, I was scared. I was relieved when my roommates got home. As the semester continued, my roommate and I had a huge project due, and in order to accommodate all the space we would need to do it, we took turns working in the living room. I worked on my project first, and then headed to bed as my roommate worked on hers. I was lying in my bed while reading, with my back to the door, when I saw a shadow come up on my book and felt like someone was behind me. Thinking it was my roommate, I turned to see what she wanted, and she wasn't there. I shrugged it off and kept reading. The shadow once again crept up on my book. I moved my blankets, my head, and the shadow didn't move. At this point, I was scared, but felt ridiculous if I mentioned it, so I pulled the covers over my head and just went to sleep. Fast forward to Halloween. We had a party and a bunch of friends were over. As the night wore on, we started talking about ghosts and spooky stuff, and lo and behold, it comes up about how everyone thinks our place is a little spooky. My roommate starts to tell a story about how one night we both had a project due and we took turns. I'm like, where is she going with this? She says she was working on her project and she saw someone out the corner of her eye walking in the hallway. So she gets up thinking it's me, and it turns out I'm asleep. She goes back to do her project and she feels something come up on her. All her hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and once again, no one is there. Now at this point, I had never mentioned to her what happened to me that same night. I told her my story and we both were in shock. The more we talk, a few people mentioned feeling like they were going to be pushed off the balcony every time they went out there. And then it comes out that two of our friends had the exact same dream when they slept over. They were paralyzed and began floating, and then began to uncontrollably spin. At this point, I'm convinced something is happening. Sometime later, I began to start seeing a shadow figure, often out of the corner of my eye in the hallway. It was dark, with no features, and I only saw it out of the corner of my eye as it quickly darted when I would look full on. I convinced myself it was just my eyes until my friend was over. We were sitting at the table talking when I got distracted for a second because I saw it, so I took a pause in the conversation, and when I looked at my friend, she said, "I saw it." I said, "Saw what?" And she replied, "That black thing in the hallway." I had never told her I saw it before, so I felt totally vindicated. The pinnacle of my experiences happened when it was winter break. My roommates had left to go home, and I was the last one there. Not wanting to be alone, I called my friend to stay. We were talking about going out, so I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth. The door was open because we were still talking. When there was a pause in our conversation, I heard a voice, plain as day, whisper my name loudly and directly into my ear. At this point, I was visibly freaked out. I confirmed with my friends that she said nothing, and we decided to leave the apartment for a while. During winter break, I had contacted a few paranormal teams who wanted to check it out after I relayed my story. When we got back from break, I told my roommates, and they were not at all interested and acted like I was nuts, though we all had experiences. I regret to this day not letting them come. So I went to church, got holy water, sprinkled my apartment, and said aloud, "This is my apartment, and you're scaring me. That's not okay, and you need to go." After that, I didn't feel much of a presence, but maybe I just believed what I did worked and learned to ignore it. I'll never know. When I was younger, my family rented an old house that we lived in until I was 5. At this point, it's quite hard for me to remember much from that time since I was so young. There are a handful of things that I've been told that happened, mostly having to do with me at the house, so I decided to finally share some. My father told me that when I was very young, before I could even walk, I would sit on the living room floor and just stare at something. My eyes would follow something that he couldn't see until one day, he went to go and get me my bottle and left me in the living room with a raccoon toy. As he rounded the corner from the hall into the living room, he saw me staring at a glowing ball. It was just floating there and then disappeared. Another time, I was maybe 1 or 2, and my older sister was playing with one of her friends. I was in one of those rolling baby walkers, just doing whatever. My sister and her friend were playing with a ball, even though my mum and dad had told her to take the ball outside and throw it around. One of them threw the ball and missed. The ball slammed into the glass light and smashed it. I happened to be under the light. You'd think that the shards of glass would hit me somewhere, but it didn't. Even the tray of the walker was clear of glass. It had completely avoided me. My father believes it was the same thing that caused the glowing ball of light. My father is a firm believer in ghosts, having many experiences that are not easily explainable. He's insistent that the house had someone or something in it. A few of his experiences were seeing a shadow in the window in the basement when he was doing laundry. It wasn't a shadow of feet or something that could have been a human, since that window was close to the ground. It was a man's head and shoulders. Another one of the weird things about that house was that my father would smell cherry tobacco smoke in the stairway. Both of my parents smoked at the time, but neither of them used cherry tobacco. We moved out of that house when I was 5, and of course moved into a house that was built in the early 1800s. Scary place, I won't lie, but it was home. The basement of this place was dirt, with a set of boarded up stairs that I never learned where they led to. Next to those stairs was a door that led to another dirt room with one window. I was terrified of that basement. I didn't learn how to do laundry for a long time because of it. Even before anything happened in that house, it gave me a weird vibe. My mother and sister would always joke about the children in the walls. I thought they were just joking around and trying to scare me. It was only later that they told me that they would hear sounds like children playing from the walls. But once they talked about it, it stopped. Great. Totally not scary at all. Nope. Not to mention the number of bats that could just break into the attic whenever they pleased. I only remember one experience from that house. There may have been more, but my memory has really gone out the window. I was alone in that big old house. My mum and dad were at work, and my sister was at a Halloween party. It was close to 9 PM, and I was sitting on the couch in the living room, watching some videos on my computer. Just to give a quick picture, the living room was large, and I can only remember the couch and the TV. The couch was up against the wall, and across from the side of the couch was a window. My sister's door was in the living room, as well as the stairs up to my room, as well as my parents' room. In the winter, I would sleep on the floor in my sister's room since we didn't have heating, and it got ungodly cold upstairs, so I wasn't paying attention, drawn in by whatever I was watching, until I heard a noise that made me look up. It was a soft tapping on the window across from me. When I looked up, there was something in the window, a shadow of a head and shoulders. Something in my mind told me it was a young boy. Don't know why. I know it wasn't the reflection of my head in the window, because I would have been lit up by the computer screen. Something made me unable to move, either fear or just the difficulty of processing what was happening. It couldn't have been a person. That window was at least 10 feet off the ground. Honestly, I'm glad it wasn't a person. When I finally got the ability to move, I bolted into my sister's room and stayed there until someone came home. I don't think I told anyone for a while until my mum and sister told me about the noises from the walls. We have since moved out, and nothing creepy has happened at the places I've lived since then. Since my family and I moved into my house in 2009 after building it, we've had a few weird instances. The first one came about when I would notice that a Snow White doll that my mum placed near the bathroom would move its head randomly. I began taking notice when one of my good friends notified me that its head had moved before and after he got out the bathroom. I began looking at it before and after I went to the bathroom and noticed a few times it had moved slightly. It didn't really bother me. The doll already was super creepy. It had those glass doll eyes that look realistic. But I don't own the house, so my parents can decorate it however they'd like. I just have to deal with it. The next one really terrified me when I was 10. We had just moved in and our furniture wasn't delivered, so I had to sleep in my big room on the floor in a sleeping bag. No electronics, nothing, just darkness. My dad was away on a trip and my mum was on the other side of the house, asleep early since she works in the medical field and has to wake up at 3 a.m. to get ready. As said before, the house wasn't furnished at all. Everything was in the garage or on the other side of the house. When out of nowhere, a music box began playing on my side of the house. I was terrified. I began hyperventilating and sinking into my sleeping bag, almost crying myself to sleep because I was confused and afraid. Eventually, I fell asleep and blocked it out of my memory. The next one really stuck with me when I was young. I was 11, my brother was born in 2009, and was only about 2 years old when my favourite grandmother passed away. Unlike him, I was very close to my dad's parents, while he was very close to my mum's parents. I was very upset. She practically raised me up until that point. I didn't want to go to school, and I was allowed to take the week off. But I had to watch my brother while my parents worked. No problem for me, I liked my brother and enjoyed playing with him, or he would sit and watch me play video games. Well, I had to use the restroom, and I took the baby monitor with me. He was in the living room on an air mattress sleeping, while I noticed a shadow of a woman in the background. I quickly got up and ran over to see what the shadow was. I thought an intruder broke in, and I'd have to get a weapon. But when I got there, the shadow wasn't visible, and in the baby monitor, it was gone as well. I believe it was my grandma, but I don't know since recently a similar shadow has appeared. I'm 20 now, in college, and only come home to sleep since I'm either at campus all day or working on campus all day. I'd just gotten home, crept into bed, and began to sleep. It's probably around 1 to 4 a.m. when I wake up, reach for my water bottle, and take a big sip. I knew if I hit my vape it would throw me back into a slumber. I hit it and turned over to face my desk since my PC's power light was on, but my monitor was off. I forgot to power it down. When I see a shadow that I thought resembled a mannequin at the center foot of my bed. Instead of feeling weirded out or dreaming, immense fear took over. I completely freaked out, threw the covers over me, and kept breathing harshly until I eventually fell asleep. Now, here's the kicker that has me feeling a little safer and looked over. We live in a nice neighborhood, but have recently had some vehicle break-ins. Despite that, however, I'm extremely paranoid about my truck and car. I live for these vehicles, but I'm only allowed to park them outside, on the street, since my parents' cars are parked in our garage. No problem, I understand. So I have major security over these vehicles. Pedal locks, steering wheel locks, kill switches, alarms, and have tarps put over my car, but not my truck since a dust storm tore it in half. Well, it was late at night again, and I woke up, pitch black besides my PC's light, which was on again, and I saw a male shadow figure in the upper corner of my room above my door. It then glided quickly to my window. I don't know why, but I wasn't startled this time. I got up,
went to my window and opened it, honestly expecting to get jump scared or see it in the distance staring menacingly at me. But no, I opened my window to see some car with no license plates and a lot of dents and dings parked in my driveway, and somebody sitting in it, looking at my truck. I have no friends with the described vehicle, so I quickly got dressed and grabbed my gun and darted outside. They got scared when I drew my weapon and drove away, almost getting shot for being on my property in the process. My vehicles were safe, and I went around the outside of my house, around the front, back, and side to side. Nobody was outside or on my property, so I went back in and went to bed. My main confusion is, why was I so afraid of the first shadow figure that I had an extreme panic attack? Yet, why was I fine with the second shadow figure? I couldn't describe them as different. The only way I know it was different was that I felt immense fear with the first one, but with the second, I had a lot of interest and was willing to get up and see where it went, which ended up helping me, not having my vehicle stolen or broken into.
For some backstory, my mother-in-law is a minister and is beyond religious. She doesn't lie and she doesn't embellish stories. This is her story. She's in her late 60s. For some odd reason, her husband, my father-in-law, and I are talking about scary things we've encountered. She doesn't like this talk. She doesn't want to invite anything, so she hardly ever joins in when we talk like this. For some reason, this time, she chimes in, and she has a story. She was young, maybe 5 or 6, in Korea. She was very sick for days. The doctor kept coming to the house 2 or 3 times a day to check on her. During the 4th night, her fever got so high that they put her in the living room with the windows open and a wet rag on her forehead. Her mum slept on a yo next to her, which is like a mat/bed. She could have been hallucinating, but she insists this is what she saw that night. She was startled awake by a growl. She was dripping with sweat and shivering. She could hear her mum next to her, but also a weird noise like scratching or dragging up above her head out of sight. She was too scared to move. Then she felt something pull her hair. Not a tug. She says it felt like several little hands grabbing at her hair and yanking as hard as they could. It made her cry out in pain, and that's when she saw them. About half a dozen little black creature men coming from the shadows in the room. Not like they were hiding in the shadows, but as if they were the shadows. The shadows turned into these men. They were not fat, chubby, pointy hat-wearing gnome-like men, but all black shadow creatures with sharp claw-like hands and sharp teeth that grinned ear to ear. They jumped on her chest, scratching and clawing at her. They continued to scratch around her chest and pull at her hair and jump up and down hard on her chest, snapping and screeching and almost laughing at her. She said the sounds they made were horrible. They growled and screeched at her for what felt like hours, but she was frozen with fear. She couldn't scream or cry or get them off of her. She was so scared, she finally passed out. The next morning, she woke up to the doctor doing his morning check and asking about all the little scratches on her neck and chest. They didn't have cats or dogs, and her mum had been there all night but heard nothing. They said she probably scratched herself trying to get the blanket off when she was overheating. My mother-in-law said she tried to tell everyone what the little men had done, but they said not to mention such things. These creatures were as black as night, had yellow eyes, pointy hands and fingers, skinny legs, very demon-like,
and came from the shadows.
I have to admit, I had a bit of whiskey, but this doesn't distract from the truth of this story. Even though I live in a well-populated area, strange things still occur. There's a hiking trail near Chatsworth Park at the northwest side of the valley next to Los Angeles. It's well known for being adjacent to Corriganville, which is close to Span Ranch. It's essentially called the Manson Hills. This is where Charles Manson and his followers used to hang out. If you end up hiking there, it's not too exciting. You may see a few bobcats and red-tailed hawks. This fact is very inconsequential to the story, but still relevant. We used to skip class at Canoga Park High School and hike in the hills. We'd smoke weed and drink without fear of being busted by local law enforcement because it was so far out of the way of LAPD's jurisdiction. My buddy, Gail, used to talk of seeing strange creatures and figures, but we would always think it was because he was high and messed up when he hiked the hills. There are also several homeowners that have property up there. It was known as a safe place to party. When we were walking up the path near the base of the trail, we saw several hooded figures. These figures were holding lanterns and walking very slowly up the path. Being so comfortable with the trails that we had used so many times, we thought nothing of it, until we decided to go up the other ridge to follow them. They suddenly disappeared. Anyone who has been up in the hills here knows that there is a considerable amount of wildlife, even though it's next to the city. It became really quiet, and we all had the feeling that we had to turn back. I want to stress that during daylight, this trail would have been no problem, but at that moment, I had that fight or flight feeling. We felt there was a general danger for our lives. I have never ran so fast down a trail in my life. Once we reached the dark trailhead at the bottom, Gail looked up and pointed at the ridge above us and screamed, "Dude, what the hell?" We all looked up and saw what I can only describe as a really tall man that was pitch black, no noise, no reaction to our presence. We left and then decided to go to another spot to hang out. Late night, up Stunt Road. I've been to the park since, but never after dark. It was closed down for a couple of years due to lead being found in the hills, and has since reopened. I've been wanting to share this story for some time, and I finally have the time to do it. So a little background info. I'm a 34-year-old female, my husband, 35, and our two daughters, 9 and 10, moved into our house back in October 2014. It was built in 1900. The following year, in 2015, I had quit my job to stay home with my youngest, then 4, and to be able to be available for school runs for my then 5-year-old who had just started kindergarten. So fast forward about a month into the school year, October 2015. One day after I dropped my kindergartner off at school, I took my youngest for a walk through a very old cemetery around the corner from our house. The cemetery is closed to new graves. Many of the tombstones date back to the late 1700s into the 1800s. The autumn foliage was beautiful. He even took a few pictures. My daughter had never been in a cemetery before and was on cloud 9. She's weird and morbid like me. She was running around inspecting the graves, asking a million questions, and as she sometimes does, she informed me about some of the history about specific graves and the people who were buried. She has a tendency to make up stories about things she sees that have happened to turn out to be facts later on. I'm not claiming she's psychic, but she definitely has my bloodline in her. I'll get into that a little later on. We went home, and within a couple of days, weird things started happening. It started with small things, like I would feel as if someone had brushed by me walking by, or something like that, but no one was there. Whenever I was in the basement doing laundry, I started feeling like someone was watching me. Then I started thinking I heard whispers or commotion coming from areas of the house no one was in. I was also going through a bit of a severe depression at the time, so at first I thought I was just going crazy. Then, one evening, I was sitting on the couch with my husband watching TV, and in the corner of the room, we both saw and heard something dark and shadowy fall from the ceiling and slam on the floor. I jumped, he jumped, we both looked at each other, and he got up to check to see what it was, and nothing was there. It was at that time that I confided in him about the brushes, whispers, and commotion. He then informs me that he has heard things too, like he would be upstairs in the shower and thought he heard me come home with the kids, front door open and talking, only to find no one was home when he came downstairs. He just didn't think anything of it, so never said anything. At this point, I realized it wasn't in my head and that our house was likely haunted. It is what it is. Then a few nights later, I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, maybe around 3 a.m. I got up because I felt wide awake, so I left my room and went out to the hallway where I suddenly noticed my youngest daughter on the first landing going down the stairs. I called out to her, "What are you doing, baby?" She looked up at me with the most frightened look I've ever seen on her face, and she said, "I heard you calling me downstairs." Chills ran through my entire body, and I told her, "Okay, well, I'm right here. Why don't you come sleep in bed with me?" She ran back up the stairs and went to bed. The next morning after I dropped my oldest off at school, I called my mum. She's, well, I don't know how to put it exactly, but basically a modern day witch, and also familiar with hauntings and such, so she tells me what I needed to do, and to come over and get supplies. The whole thing basically consisted of putting crystals behind all of the doors in the house, spreading Himalayan salt across the doorways, going outside and also spreading the salt around each corner of the house, and blessing it, and then finally saging the entire house. I'm familiar with the saging, as I've done it before. Everything is going fine until the saging comes. I get a fire-safe ashtray, fill it up with dried sage, light it, and begin the process starting from the upstairs, working my way down to the basement. My youngest is with me during this process. I get through the entire house and down to the basement when suddenly the ashtray explodes in my hand. It literally exploded. Freaked me the hell out, and my daughter. I send her upstairs and I clean up the mess. Meanwhile, the entire time I feel like someone is watching me. At that point, I immediately called my mum and told her what happened. She then decided she would come over and resage the house. We got to talking and trying to figure out what was going on. What caused this sudden haunting after a year of living there? We came to the conclusion that it was likely many factors. The veil is at its thinnest during the month of October, which basically means the connection to our world and the supernatural grows stronger during this time. I've also been susceptible to the supernatural since childhood, but that's another story. And my depression likely brought out anything that was laying dormant. And my youngest daughter possibly brought something back with her from our cemetery trip, just before all of this started happening, or awakened something when she was there. After that, everything calmed down and basically went back to normal. On Halloween that year, just a few days after the saging and whatnot, we were with a group trick-or-treating, and my friend told me to tell everyone about what was going on. The mass consensus was that we should burn the house to the ground. We did not, and virtually nothing happened since.